Jo, děkuji.
Just checking with them.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Martin Fax. I'm the head of the Center for International Humanitarian Operational Law here at the Palacký University in Olomouc. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, those of you who came personally to this workshop and those of you who joined us online. The workshop is dedicated to legal, political, and security aspects, dynamics of the conflict in northern Mozambique. We are all now busy, and there is another topic omnipresent in our lives and in the media around the world. But nevertheless, this is also a topic which needs to be addressed, and there is many aspects which will be addressed today by our distinguished speakers, which are in common with what's going on also in Ukraine. But it will be up to the speakers to, let's say, highlight and to give us an update on what's going on in northern Mozambique. It's my pleasure that I can now give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Marcos Vicevic, who is the main organizer of the workshop, and he will introduce the topic as such, and also afterwards the speakers. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Fax. First of all, we'd like to thank all the participants that are here in person. For those of you that are online, we also want to thank you for the time, and also we thank you for the interest in this topic. On this side of the world, I guess it receives a little bit less attention than other topics. Just quickly, some administrative and organizational issues. Because it's customary now to rely on Zoom and so on. So if you get kicked out of the meeting, we're available on email the entire time. So just pop us an email. The link is such that you should be able to get back online just by clicking on the link again. And we will, the program has been set, but we have colleagues from the EU mission in Mozambique who are going to try to make it today. They've had some technical issues. They were flying from Cabo Delgado to Maputo, where they're headquartered. And they had some issues that had to make an emergency landing halfway through. So we have tried to slot their session in at the end, but it's possible that if they come on earlier, we'll just move the program just a bit to accommodate these colleagues. So, from my side, I think that's it. I think we're going to start with the first session. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, and the first speaker is Liesl Lovaldran. I'll just quickly introduce her. And Liesl, I just want to see if we unmute you, if you can hear us and if we can hear you.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you perfectly. I'm just going to quickly introduce you, and then you can, I suppose, share your screen.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Liesl is a senior researcher and project leader for Southern Africa at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. She also edits the Institute's African Union Peace and Security Council reports. She completed her master's degree in politics at the University of Pretoria with a focus on Francophone Africa as a challenge to South Africa's foreign policy. And in 2016, she published a book titled South Africa in Africa, Superpower or Neo-Colonialist, which focus on South Africa's foreign policy and its role in Africa since the end of apartheid. So, Liesl has spent 25 years living and traveling within the African continent in a professional capacity as a foreign correspondent for Media 24, as their Africa editor, and of course as a researcher for the Institute for Security Studies. And in 2019, she was named Knight of the National Order of Merit by the French government for her work promoting French in South Africa. Liesl, without further ado, I think we'll give you the floor, and if you can share the screen.
Right. Thank you very much. Let's see if my share screen works. Can you see? Yeah, I think it is working. Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks, Marco. Thanks for inviting me. As you said, my name is Liesl Lovaldran. I'm a senior researcher, project leader at the Institute for Security Studies. And we, the ISS, are based in Pretoria, but we have offices around the continent in Dakar, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. I work closely with the Addis Ababa office on issues of African Union peace and security, and also lately a lot on SADC and Southern Africa. So we have focused for many years on research, policy advice regarding violent extremism threats across the continent, in the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Horn of Africa from our various offices, and researchers based in Bamako, Dakar, also in N'Djamena and elsewhere. So very briefly, I've been asked to speak about the background to the crisis in northern Mozambique and some of the current developments. My colleague in Maputo, I'm hoping he will join us a bit later, or I think he's already joined us, Borges Namire. He will also speak later afternoon about this afternoon about how things are evolving on the ground. We work closely together with a big team here in Pretoria and elsewhere. As I said, some of my colleagues have been working on issues around violent extremism around the continent and the responses to them for a very long time. So perhaps just to start, as you all know, the conflict is now in northern Mozambique is now over 4 years old since the first attacks in Cabo Delgado in 2017. Let me just come to my map. It is a very complex issue. And so in my presentation, I will just briefly outline the context of the crisis. I will touch on some of the outcomes of our current research around understanding the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, and finally, just very briefly look at some of the key developments on the ground, which I'm sure other speakers will also touch on. So here, perhaps on my first slide, just to remind ourselves, Cabo Delgado is in the northernmost district of Mozambique, bordering southern Tanzania. The area west of Cabo Delgado, the Nyasa province, also borders Malawi. And as you can see, around Cabo Delgado, we also have the Comores, the Seychelles, and then the island of Madagascar. So when we speak about the origins of the conflict, the conflict emerges and continues in a very, very challenging context, with many issues that we can identify as contributing to the tensions and the crisis, and almost a mix of various root causes that have exacerbated the conflict. So very, very briefly, just to name a few, when the conflict started, we in Cabo Delgado, and these attacks of small groups who were attacking villages, and especially the harbor town of Mosambo da Praia, there was already in the rest of Mozambique an ongoing low-level conflict with the Renamo rebels, that had been going on since 1992, and up to 2019, a major agreement was reached. But the reason why I also note this, and perhaps other speakers will as well, it has contributed in a sense to weakening somehow the Mozambican military because of the DDR process that was ongoing. So literally when the violence started, the conflict started, there was already, I would say, an unstable security situation in other parts, mostly the central region of Mozambique. So that in the first place. The second issue is political contestation, disputes regarding elections, the legitimacy of the ruling Frelimo. The last elections were in 2019. Again, next year, we will have local elections, and then again, presidential elections. So there is, Frelimo is the ruling party and has been in power since independence, but there's a lot of contestation, opposition, are disputing the outcome of elections. The third context I think we could speak about is huge development challenges in terms of infrastructure, lacking infrastructure, especially in northern Mozambique. Roads, schools, clinics, service delivery. Mozambique, despite all the natural resources and all the advantages it has, is still one of Africa's poorest countries. Also, we have seen in the last few decades already the dire effects of climate change in Mozambique. Mozambique is prone to cyclones, and even this month, and Borges can also speak to us a bit more about that, people have been displaced due to the latest cyclones. There was the cyclone Kenneth, Idai. So if we speak about the 850,000 people that are IDPs in Cabo Delgado, some of them have actually been uprooted and had to leave their homes due to cyclones and climate change. This also happens in a context of illicit trafficking. There, especially in northern Mozambique, have been many reports around drug trafficking, even heroin trafficking, wood, and wildlife trafficking, also human trafficking in that area. There's a new report that has just come out by the Global Initiative that we have also been part of. And actually, interestingly, there aren't any clear indications of a very clear link between the violent extremist groups and illicit trafficking in Cabo Delgado. But of course, that creates that atmosphere of criminality, illicit trafficking, and makes it very difficult to provide peace and security in that area. And then finally, the discovery of massive amounts of liquid natural gas in the Rovuma Basin in northern Mozambique, as well as rubies. Mozambique, in northern Mozambique, has some of the biggest, or the biggest, ruby mines in the world. And so maybe just to go to that very last issue of natural gas and rubies, what we have found in our research is that these major resource finds and the fact that people had been displaced from certain areas has exacerbated tensions, increased frustration and anger amongst the population. Many people see the discovery of natural resources and the governance of these resources as some of the principal causes of the insurgency. Now, how do we know this? We at the ISS, with our partners on the ground, have done research on the ground where we've done major surveys, actually more than surveys, but interviews with key people in Cabo Delgado. 309 responded to our questionnaires. I'm just going to show you 2 slides. We don't have that much time, but maybe just on the issue of the root causes and specifically the discovery of rubies and natural gas. As I said, so we asked these 300 people, what do you see as the root causes of the crisis? And overwhelmingly, 139 people said the discovery of rubies and natural gas. Now, we know from many years and engaging with many people, there is no proof on the ground that the Al-Sunna groups, who are called Al-Shabaab, are on the ground. The armed groups in Mozambique are not directly linked to, they are not declared motivated by wanting to have access to these natural resources. But this is, as I said, this has heightened tensions. We are talking about, by far, the biggest ever investment, foreign direct investment on the African continent to date. The promises that were made in 2016 of $60 billion worth of investment in this liquid natural gas in Cabo Delgado. Now, as many of you know, because of the attacks, especially last year, March, in Palma and Cabo Delgado, the main investor, Total, have suspended their operations. So a lot of this is on hold. But when when, as I say, the conflict started, there was this huge expectation and promises of masses or amounts of funding, and also for the government that would flow into their pockets from the discovery of natural gas, and as I say, from rubies as well. The displacement due to the big ruby mines in Montepuez also exacerbated tensions. So we asked people also, we gave them a different choice. I mean, this is a questionnaire that I've got 45 slides, so I'm going to spare you that. But just to show you, as I say, the discovery of rubies and natural gas, illicit arms flow, illicit trafficking is also seen by many as one of the root causes of the crisis. Economic marginalization, middle class or elite greed, a lot of corruption, then the governance, poor governance and poor management of natural resources. Interestingly, and I'll come back to that, issues around ethnic discrimination ranked far lower than some would perhaps think. Youth unemployment is very high in Cabo Delgado and could be a source of radicalization. And political and economic exclusion are all of the issues that we have identified in various studies as root causes. But the discovery of natural gas, I think, as you can see from the slide, is considered by people as being very important. Maybe, and just the other slide that I'm going to show, because there's a lot of debate around who exactly are responsible for the violent attacks in northern Mozambique. The links with the Islamic State, maybe some of the other speakers will also address this, but overwhelmingly our research and honestly over many, many years now, we have come to the conclusion that the conflict in northern Mozambique has got local roots. It's a local group. People on the ground call them, as I say, Al-Shabaab. It's not the same group as the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, but there are definitely links along the East African coast, the Swahili coast. And so in our survey, by far 51% of people said those responsible for the violence are Ansar al-Sunnah or Al-Shabaab. 19%, almost 20% said they don't know. Al-Shabaab and ISIS, 10%, Al-Shabaab and security forces. There's quite a bit of let's say, disagreement, or one, I think we should unpack the fact that in our survey also people weren't very open about their sense that the security forces might also have been responsible for perhaps, I mean, the Amnesty International studies and so on show that there have been cases where security forces have been guilty of human rights abuses against civilians, but that didn't come out in our survey. Foreigners, other ISIS, Al-Shabaab security forces, and then the Islamic State, when people were asked who are responsible, only 2.7% of people said the Islamic State. So as I say, there have been many, many studies and debates around the link. Definitely the Islamic State have claimed many, many of the attacks in Cabo Delgado. So we know there is that link. So that is our research, which hasn't been published yet. We are still working on the study, but this is just a glimpse to show you what our ISS research has found. Of course, and I think many of you are asking the question about the radicalization, the fact that these groups clearly identify themselves or the Al-Shabaab group as violent extremists. There is a history of radicalization. In fact, some of the other research we did way back, 2018, was that it was a small sect that was created in a part of Cabo Delgado that then, as I said, was exacerbated by some of these tensions. So it can be traced back many years before the actual first attacks. There were influences from radicalization from Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. These frustrations were exploited then. And as I said, there are many reports of these links with the Islamic State. I mean, we can discuss that in question and answer session. And the link is with the Islamic State in Central African province, because we have also looked at people who have been arrested and their profiles, and there are several Tanzanian, Congolese, etc. There is a link with the ADF, which is a group in Uganda and the Eastern DRC. So, but it's important to stress that this is not a religious conflict. I think, as most of the violent extremist conflicts and crises that we have on our continent, these are violent extremists that exploit and radicalize people due to other frustrations. So maybe just very briefly on the ground, as I said, there have been 4 years of conflict. It has followed almost the same pattern over the last couple of years, where the attacks are mainly on the villages. People are chased out of their homes. They've been very gruesome beheadings. Towns are burnt down. So it's slightly different than what we might see in other places like the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, even with Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin, where you have almost half of the province that have fled their homes. And then a lot of the attacks we know are because the insurgents are now looting food, especially like in the rainy season, which is now, Borges can talk a bit more about that as well. So there hasn't been exactly the same trajectory, but it's also very difficult to predict, because we saw this month and at the end of February, some attacks, direct attacks again on the military, for the Mozambican military, actually in Macomia, which is north of Pemba, in an area where normally, according to the SAMIM, the Southern African intervention in Mozambique, and the Rwandan forces and the Mozambican Defense Force, that the insurgents have been driven out of those bases. So it has followed that pattern, but there are also, it's also very difficult to predict. In fact, so just to give you a short overview, according to ACLED, which has got weekly reports about the situation in Cabo Delgado, it's the armed conflict report, ACLED, that we use a lot. Up to date, around 3,800 people have been killed in the conflict, 800,000 IDPs, which comparatively to the size of the conflict itself and the area is huge, loss of lives and livelihoods. And now what we see since the suspension of the big Total project of last year, there has only one of the three big LNG projects led by the Italian company Eni, which is offshore, is going ahead. The others are on hold until the security situation stabilizes. So here's the very last report of ACLED that you can see. What we have noticed since the end of last year, actually the beginning of this year, is that there have been attacks outside of Cabo Delgado in the Nyasa province towards the west, also northwards towards the Tanzanian border, Namgade, and more or less the area around the LNG Palma, where the big attack happened last year, is secured by the Rwandan military forces. And then Pemba in the south is the capital of Cabo Delgado. This is where all the UN staff and so on are, and the IDPs. And for now, the Southern African mission for Mozambique, the SAMIM, are acting almost as a buffer to make sure that Pemba remains protected. Then just finally, the big development last year, in the middle of last year, so after this big attack in March 2021, the Rwandan Defense Force, upon request and invitation by the Mozambican government, deployed, they now have around 2,000 troops in the area around Palma, the Fungi Peninsula, Mosambo da Praia, so the areas where the big Total LNG project is. They managed to secure many of the areas. And then also in July, actually more around September, but officially from July, the Southern African SADC forces deployed. I think I have another slide here. So the Rwandan Defense Force is around 2,000 troops. The SADC mission in Mozambique is now being scaled up. At the moment, only around 1,000 troops are on the ground. But South Africa has recently announced an increase in its troops. Mostly it's being led by South Africa. And so we mostly have South African troops from Botswana, Lesotho, and Tanzania. They are the main troop contributing countries. And as I said there, the need for coordination is key, and we're not really seeing it. It's a complex political issue between Rwanda, SADC, Mozambique, that myself and my colleagues have written a lot about, because that concerns us being based here in South Africa. So finally, just the way forward, there are dialogue efforts, and if I say dialogue, it's more non-military solutions that are being tried by various groups on the ground, trying also to work with the local communities, religious groups, and to try and ensure that radicalization and violent extremism doesn't take root and doesn't spread in Southern Africa. We are seeing now a greater role for the African Union. SADC, as I said, SADC has deployed, but SADC is also increasingly conscious of the fact that this is a threat that can't be eradicated through military means, and that it's important to deal with the root causes, to look at development and many other issues. And we have had, as the ISS, interactions with SADC and with SAMIM in Maputo very recently as last week. There are plans for reconstruction of Cabo Delgado. Europe, the World Bank, the European Union, and others are pledging funds for this. There's currently training going on of Mozambican security forces. The US government, Portugal, and the EU training mission are busy training Mozambican forces. And then finally, there's a huge dire need for humanitarian assistance. So we have all the UN agencies, the IOM, the World Food Programme, many others on the ground, but it's really not sufficient. And then, as I said, we have these threats in terms of the cyclones and so on, which really just worsens the situation on the ground. So that's, in short, a very brief overview. I can take questions, or let me stop sharing my screen. If there's any more details that you would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liesl. We'll just jump straight into the questions, and we're just going to be trying and be mindful of the time. We have one question on the chat. Do you know if these groups are involved in sort of state building activities, even basic ones like providing security for local populations, or only abusing locals?
Yes, that's a good question, because that's something that we saw, for example, in Somalia, where groups are substituting where the state isn't providing services, but we have not seen that. We have not seen that in Cabo Delgado. There was once, I think Borges might be able to also assist me there, but there was once an incident where we said there was a hearts and minds attempt by the insurgents in Mozambique prior, where they were handing out food and so, but that was short-lived. We don't see that phenomenon in Cabo Delgado. Okay. There are local militia groups that are formed sometimes of veterans, war veterans from the independence war and so on. That is a phenomenon that we do see. It's almost substituting them, but the insurgents themselves are not providing that some kind of security or assistance to local people.
Okay, thank you. And just one other question from our side here. From your side and from the ISS, do you have any estimate of how many insurgents are currently operating in the province?
I really don't know. We don't know. I mean, I think there have been so far 400 arrests. So that gives you an indication in these last few years. There have been quite a few reports. Our problem is also these SADC and the Rwandan mission don't really communicate that much on casualties. So it's really very, very difficult for me to say.
Okay, thank you. Then I will just open it up to the floor if there are any questions from the participants here.
Well, I may have one question. Petr Pospíšil, Minister of Defense, General Staff. You mentioned about 800,000 internally displaced persons. Are these people only running from the violence out of fear? Or do you know that are there any indications that these people are forced out of their homes for purpose? Do you understand?
Yes, yes, I think so. They are definitely forced out of their homes. So their villages are attacked and burnt down. Some of their family members are killed, as I said, in a very gruesome way. So there's no way for them to go back. Their fields have been burnt down. So their livelihoods have been taken away. Villages, fishermen can't, it's not safe for them to fish. They've been physically chased away. I know we don't have time, but, in our study, we have so many testimonies of people who fled in the middle of the night, had to spend days without food in the bush until finally they got to safety in around Pemba and other places in the south. So there are, of course, people who sort of preemptively, if that's what you're saying, are fleeing because they are scared. And we saw that one of the big questions we were asked these last few months is whether the conflict's going to spread to Malawi, for example, and how big is the regional spread. So there have been some refugees fleeing over the border to Malawi, but from what we understand, that is sort of preemptively. There was one or two big attacks where people were attacked and they fled from that village. But the people who the UNHCR are now looking after in Malawi are perhaps, what you're talking about, people just being scared of perhaps being attacked in future.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions on the floor, I think, Liesl, thank you very much. If you will stay on for the remainder of the session, we have dedicated some time afterwards, maybe if there are additional questions and so on.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liesl. Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Professor Bohumil Dobos. Can I just get an indication, Prof. Dobos, if you can hear us?
I can hear you well. Hi.
Okay, excellent, and we can hear you. Okay, Prof. Dobos will speak about the Mozambican insurgency and the link between territorial control. Just to quickly introduce Prof. Dobos, Bohumil is a researcher at the Institute of Political Studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University. Bohumil's professional interests are rooted in geopolitics, and his research primarily focuses on the territoriality of violent non-state actors and the behavior of non-state actors in general. the space and the study of astropolitics, and space security, and the study of the New Middle Ages as a theory of global order. The regional focus of Bohemil's research is primarily within Africa and the Middle East, and Bohemil has published extensively within this area, including in international journals such as Small Wars and Insurgencies and Astropolitics. Prof. Dobos, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, we with our colleagues, we are, as a part of our research, developing how to study the territoriality of violent non-state actors, specifically focusing on the radical jihadist groups, meaning that, of course, we wanted to include the Ansar al-Sunnah, or whatever you want to call the group, inside our studies, preparing a study on this as well. And basically, the gist of what I wanted to say today was already answered in the previous Q&A, as it's pretty clear that the group is not really territorially as well established and as other jihadist groups around the continent. However, I will try to elaborate on that. Territoriality basically is an attempt to control region, to establish your power through setting some geographical limits. In order to do so, the group does not have to only to delimitate the territory upon which it operates, but also to manage it somehow. In order to manage it, you need to cooperate with the local population, provide them with some services, and through this population, you can make use of the territory. Basically, if you cannot cooperate with the local people, it is impossible to control the territory, which is the basis of state building efforts around the world. For the non-state actors, what is also relevant in case they aim to establish some territorial entity, which is a goal of basically all of the Islamic State affiliates around the world, and Ansar al-Sunnah is officially pledged as an Islamic State affiliate in Mozambique or part of the wider Islamic State group in the Central Africa province. If they want to establish such territorial entities, these groups necessarily have to operate in regions where there are some territorial openings. And as was well established by the previous presentation, Northern Mozambique is presenting such opportunities simply because the central government in Maputo had very limited power projection capabilities in Northern Mozambique. Its ability to control the region are contested at least ever since the civil war in Mozambique. There are issues with the development of the province, etc., which basically sets up such an opening, which was then hijacked by the Ansar al-Sunnah group. After some progress of the insurgency, we can analyze whether the group is actually establishing some territorial entity, whether it is developing some administration akin, for example, the Somali al-Shabaab, or whether it is more exploitative of this permissive context. And if we want to analyze the level of territoriality, actually, there are several methodologies that can be applied. And we prefer to approach the territorial dimension from basically three points of view. First is the point of view of security. Second is the point of view of economy. And the third is some identitarian issue. If we look at the security, the issue is basically about capability to delimit some territory, to protect it against the external opponents, and to provide some administrative structures inside of this territory. And once again, looking at the examples around the world, we can see different levels of such activity. And applying this to Northern Mozambique, Ansar al-Sunnah was well engaged in enhancing its territorial control over even some more significant population centers like Mocambo de Praia or the attack on Palma. So there is no issue with the willingness of the group to actually engage in the territorial control. What is, however, much weaker is its ability to administer this territory. As was already established, the group is not providing any meaningful services to the population. It is mainly misusing its dominant position on some territories, which is an approach that does not really allow an actor to become territorial, to develop some meaningful territorial presence that can then lead to utilization of the territory, setting up some proto-state structures, like, for example, Al-Shabaab's presence in Somalia, or the parts of the Islamic State self-proclaimed caliphate in the Middle East. And what was also highly problematic for the Ansar al-Sunnah was the issue that it was basically unable to engage in direct military combat with any more relevant opponents, which was very well observable after the Rwandan intervention in the country that basically destroyed any meaningful hold of Ansar al-Sunnah in any of the population centers that are necessary for the projection of territorial power. So from the security point of view, the Ansar al-Sunnah and its connection to the territory is rather weak. If we look at the second aspect, economy, there are several types of sources that we can highlight that are being utilized by the violent non-state actors. There is a group of non-territorial resources like utilization of fake charities, utilization of cybercrime, external support, etc. Semi-territorial sources which need some territorial presence, however, not a sustained territorial control, like smuggling and so on. And then there are clearly territorial sources of financing, like taxation, like management of natural resources, for which, however, the group needs to have a control over certain land for a protracted period of time. Once again, the territorial resources are the most beneficial for the group because they generally create the biggest outcome. However, for using them, you need to have an actual control. And looking at the case of Ansar al-Sunnah, once again, we can observe that it utilized the semi-territorial resources at best. It got involved in the smuggling, especially cross-border into Tanzania and elsewhere. There are well-established smuggling routes with a lot of resources that are exploited from the region or just passing through the region, like some narcotics and stuff. And Ansar al-Sunnah made use of these financing sources. However, it was unable to tap into any taxative efforts, etc., which would actually require some development of some administrative structures. So once again, if we look at the economic side, the connection with the territory is rather weak. And finally, looking at the identity side, there is once again some clash between the different ways how the group, at least publicly, identifies itself. On the one hand, it is clearly a local phenomenon. The group has established as a reaction on local issues, and it's composed mainly, as far as we know from the available sources, it is developed of Mozambicans or Tanzanians, meaning that there is a clear connection to the local causes, and the vast majority of the fighters are coming from the region. On the other hand, the group has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. It has directly involved itself in this global network and is not really well incorporated into the local structures, into the local identities, being extremely brutal against local population, which steers away the local identity towards a more globalist vision of the Islamic State that actually manage these very brutal tactics, where you basically target anyone who did not join the group. Everyone who is not a member is to be targeted, which is not how the territorial local groups behave. This is how the affiliates of the Islamic State behave all around the world. So even if we look at the identity issue, the connection of Ansar al-Sunnah to territory is rather weak. Now, Through this analysis, we can say that the group was semi-territorial at best, and this is if we give them a little benefit of doubt. And the important question is, what does it mean for us, for the analysis of the conflict? First, importantly, this means that the group does not offer any meaningful alternative to the state. Even though it makes use of the lacking power projection capabilities of the Mozambican state, it does not provide any alternative structures, meaning that there are larger openings from the side of the central government and the external donors to actually end the conflict, as the local population will not very likely in majority perceive Ansar al-Sunnah as a vocal alternative. This is completely different from what we see from conflicts in Mali or Somalia, where the Islamist insurgents are actually providing some meaningful alternative to state, making the ending to the conflict much harder. In case of Mozambique, if meaningful policies and developments are being utilized, then Ansar al-Sunnah will be probably successfully pushed into the periphery. There just needs to be some continuous activity in the region. And second of all, if we want to understand the group in the context of the insurgencies of sub-Saharan Africa, we can spot much more similarities between Ansar al-Sunnah and, for example, groups like Boko Haram that also ravage the territory, utilize a very brutal, non-compromising strategy, pushing them into the peripheries of their respective peripheries, rather than comparing them with groups like Al-Shabaab, despite the similar name that is being used, which are actually providing some alternatives, and the ways how to engage in this conflict are completely different, because we are dealing with a group with a sustainable territorial control. So this would be my input into debate. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Bohumil. We'll again just jump straight into the questions from our side. Just one, in terms of your thesis about territorial control, would you then say it's accurate? It's an accurate conclusion that part of the gain in territorial control of the insurgencies or the group is linked also to a lack of effective territorial control by the state?
Definitely, this is basically a necessary condition for any territorial group. If there is an efficient territorial control by a state, there cannot be an efficient territorial control by a non-state actor. In case the states are more effective, then the non-state actors are turning into non-territorial strategies, setting up some networks, etc. As being territorial makes you easier to target. And if the state is effective, it will be very easy for it to destroy you. If the state is not being present in the region, you can set up some territorial structures. So this is like a necessary condition to start this insurgency in the first place.
Okay, thank you. We will now open up to the floor if there are any questions from participants here. Okay, there being no questions, thank you very much, Bohumil.
Thank you.
Once again, we have that discussion session at the end. So if you will remain online, then there could be questions at that stage. Okay, we're going to jump now to our third speaker, Dr. Anil De Beer. Anil, can we just get an indication if you can hear us and see us? We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Still muted. I know it still seems that you're muted.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Okay, all good. Thank you. Okay, our third speaker and the concluding session for the first half of the workshop, Dr. Anil De Beer is an extraordinary lecturer at the University of Pretoria and a research associate at the South African Research Chairs Initiative in International Law based at the University of Johannesburg. She also serves as an external expert here at SIGO. Dr. De Beer holds a doctorate in international law and has lectured and published internationally in various topics of interest in international law, including international terrorism, human rights, cyber terrorism, the use of force, peremptory norms of international law, collective responsibility of organized armed groups for sexual and gender-based violence during non-international armed conflicts. And her book on peremptory norms of general international law and the prohibition of terrorism won the 2020 American Society of International Law Lieber Prize, recognizing an exceptional publication in the field of armed conflict. Anil, thank you very much for the time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco. Is it possible to share my presentation, or must I share it from my side?
If you can just try and share it from your side, because I think the function is working now. Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely to talk to you today about this crisis in Mozambique and be among all these eminent speakers. So what I'm going to share with you today is I'm going to look specifically at the issue of foreign fighters in Mozambique. Yes.
Anil, sorry, is it just possible? We're just struggling to hear you a little bit. It's just a little soft.
Sorry, it seems that my audio is just not.
Perhaps if you switch off the camera, that might help.
If I switch off the camera, sure. Okay.
Well, it's not from our side.
Okay, all right. Anil, we'll just try and turn the volume up here, and then if you can just speak a little louder, and then I think we should be fine.
All right. Okay, I hope this. Let me do this. Okay, so I hope that's better.
That's better, yes.
Okay, great. All right. So yes, so what I'd like to speak to you about today is the issue of foreign fighters in Mozambique, and then also the link between these foreign fighters and ISIS. So in general, sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. So by way of background, what I'm going to discuss is, firstly, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the use of force by Rwanda in Mozambique. Then I'll touch on the issues of foreign fighters and terrorism. And what I also like to do is to look at the applicable legal regime that applies to these foreign fighters and touch on issues of international responsibility. So by way of background, and this is something that the speakers before me have alluded to as well. So Ansar al-Sunnah wa Jama'ah is an Islamist militia group in northern Mozambique. And they are responsible for a conflict that has killed over 2,000 people and displaced over 800,000. So this is all against the backdrop of economic marginalization in Mozambique. And as alluded to by a previous speaker, one of the big causes of this was the discovery of natural gas. And then the project by Total, where unfortunately the local community didn't really see much of a change in their living circumstances. So when this group started in Mocimboa da Praia, and they took over the port where the natural gas project was located, there were a lot of efforts made to quell this insurgency. The Mozambican army tried, various mercenaries tried as well with no success. And it's only the Rwandan army that finally made a difference in August 2021. Now, as far as I know, Total has indicated that it might start the natural gas project again later this year, because as long as the Rwandan army has control there, then there is a possibility that it be restarted. So the first issue I'd like to look at is the use of force by Rwanda. So as we know, the prohibition on the use of force covers just two exceptions. I know some people argue for a third one, humanitarian intervention, but I belong to the school of two exceptions. So it's United Nations Security Council authorization and, of course, self-defense. But as we know, to get United Nations Security Council authorization is quite hard, and most states rely on self-defense. You'll see that my next slide is just a little depiction of the veto, which is just shows how unbalanced it is, because it's extremely difficult that one of the members of the Permanent Five does not veto a resolution on the use of force. So states rely on self-defense, which obviously falls into the category of the jus ad bellum and has the requirements of an armed attack attributable to a state and a response which is both necessary and proportionate. So what I want to look at very quickly, because other speakers will speak on it, I think, in more detail, is whether this was a situation of collective self-defense or intervention by invitation. And I think that when we look at the situation, a collective self-defense is usually in the context of an IAC and not a non-international armed conflict, because you don't have an attack on the same territory of the victim state. You have an attack originating from another state. In this example, it's state B, and state B uses force in the victim state's territory, state A, and state A then runs to the third party state and says, please help us. And here you do have to justify the use of force by the third party state. And the third party state would have to meet the requirements of armed attack, attribution and necessity and proportionality. So this seems to me closer to intervention by invitation. I don't think it's that simple. I think there are some problems maybe with consent in this scenario, but for these purposes, it's closer to that than collective self-defense, because the force was used against Mozambique in the territory of Mozambique. So was it intervention by invitation? I'm not going to answer all of these questions because it's more by way of background and I'm going to focus on foreign fighters. But just some questions that come to mind is it had to be valid consent by the state, freely given and clearly established. That's just the requirements under Dashiwa, the draft articles on responsibility of states. So was President Nyusi authorized to give consent? Some writers have said that he didn't consult Parliament and he should have. Is the invitation by a legitimate government? Do they still have effective control over territory, or is recognition enough? Consent by regional authority like SADC legitimized the sending of foreign troops. That's just some of the issues, even though I think broadly, there wasn't really a public outcry or global public outcry when Rwanda intervened and quelled the insurgency, but just some things to keep in mind. So now to discuss the issue of fighters in Mozambique. Speakers have alluded to the fact that Mozambique was just a fertile ground for foreign fighters. You had poverty, you had an ascendant insurgent movement, and Ansar al-Sunnah wa Jama'ah has deep local roots. It means, I think, young boys or young men, and they actually were speaking for the local population. Now, what's interesting is one would think that they would have a lot of combatants from ISIS all over the world joining their ranks. But reports that I've read is even though the local portion or contingent of the insurgency, it's about 2,000 people. When you look at how many fighters don't come from the neighboring countries, but from countries further afield, it's maybe a couple of hundred. So this is not really a situation where ISIS members are flocking en masse to join this insurgency. Even though I think the international attention actually came when the US State Department declared them a specially designated global terrorist or foreign terrorist organization. And now, after the Palma attack, this group invited all of this international attention. I'm not entirely sure that that was for the group in any event, that was a good thing. And I'll elaborate on that a bit further later. But what happens is that when foreign fighters from further afield join these insurgent movements, they bring with them new weapons and new strategies, but there are also cultural differences. And there are often leadership challenges. Now, the minute that there are leadership challenges, what happens is it affects the command structure of that whole group. So that's actually rather interesting, where one would think that foreign fighters would strengthen them, they don't always. So in this slide, I try to set out all the different types of non-state actors, because as we all know, in international law, terminology is very important. So we've got foreign fighters, we've got mercenaries, terrorists, organized armed groups, private military security companies, and then various other entities. For these purposes, because it's an armed conflict, I'm going to look at mercenaries, foreign fighters, terrorists, and OAGs, and to an extent, private military security companies. So foreign fighters can be terrorists, but they're not necessarily. It really depends if they commit terrorist acts. So I always say with terrorism, you don't look at the actor, you look at the act. Anyone can commit an act of terrorism. So when we look at what terrorism is, briefly, even though there's no internationally agreed upon treaty definition, there is, according to me, a definition in customary international law. It's the kind of thing where not only you recognize it when you see it, but in the legislation of most of the countries globally, you've got common elements, an act of violence against civilians to instill fear for a political purpose, and a transnational element. And there's absolutely no exceptions to acts of terrorism. So what I've done here is I've just set out a few statements by states at the General Assembly, where it's shown that terrorism can never be justified for any cause, whether ideological, religious, political, racial, ethnic, or any other reasons. No ideology or creed can justify terrorism. So if we look at foreign fighters and mercenaries, there was a study by the United Nations Security, it's a study by a UN working group that looked at mercenaries. And they argued that mercenaries or foreign fighters are actually modern day mercenaries. I don't think this is entirely true, because foreign fighters have different motivations than mercenaries. Mercenaries are really motivated by financial gain. They're not private military security companies, as I've said there, but they are professional services of people paid to intervene in a conflict. Because it's intervention in often civil war or NIAC, there are issues with self-determination and also impact on human rights. But usually when mercenaries complete their task, they go. They don't hang around. They're completely different from foreign fighters. But what's interesting with foreign fighters is that UNSC resolution in 2014 has actually made the link between foreign fighters and terrorism, because they said that foreign terrorist fighters are actually foreign fighters who travel to a country with the purpose of perpetrating or participating in terrorist acts. So foreign fighters often cite the right to self-determination as a reason, but we know that there is actually no justification if acts of terrorism are committed. So while there are similarities, foreign fighters fall in a completely different group to mercenaries. And I've just set out, even though there are some similarities, I think there are more differences. So what legal regime can we apply to foreign fighters? There are writers that say, well, it should just be one legal regime. The overlap is too difficult. I think that a few legal regimes can apply. IHL can apply, counterterrorism can apply, but also international criminal law can apply. There are some difficulties. For example, in IHL, there's a complaint that support to terrorists are prohibited, but support can also be humanitarian support. And of course, that support should be given to terrorists as well as to the other party to a conflict. Counterterrorism legislation, it's always controversial when there's a terrorist act or when it's not a terrorist act. And then, of course, under international criminal law, there's prosecutions for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So then, briefly, I think that all three legal regimes can actually find application because IHL binds foreign fighters, and of course it binds all parties to a NIAC, and AP2 of the Geneva Conventions prohibits acts of terrorism. We look at the act committed, and if the foreign fighter commits a terrorist act, then he would be in breach of counterterrorism legislation, and then can also be cumulative, in my view, in any event, cumulatively prosecuted under international criminal law if he's guilty of any of those crimes. So when it comes to international responsibility, I looked at possible international responsibility of foreign fighters where they form part of an organized armed group. So even though that's not currently something that I think there's a framework for in law, because you look at the individual criminal responsibility of foreign fighters, it would be very useful if we can get to a framework where we hold that organized armed group as an entity responsible. If we look at the draft articles for international responsibility of state, and we look at the fact that you can attribute acts to a state where the state has effective control or overall control over the act, say non-state actor, I think you could argue that the same be done when you look at an organized armed group and its members, because there, the organized armed group also exercises effective control over its members, if, of course, it has that command structure, it can impose discipline, etc. And that is where the foreign fighters coming from further afield can have an effect. Because if those foreign fighters infiltrate the ranks of this local group and there's an upheaval to the command structure, it may even be that we can't classify that entity as an organized armed group. This is just to show you very briefly what I'm referring to is to try and hold this entity, the organized armed group, should they qualify as an organized armed group, and of course I'm referring to the group in Mozambique, to hold this entity liable and not only the members individually. So that's that's just a repeat of what I've just said, which is the effect of foreign fighters. It's not always a net positive for an insurgent group because they impact the command structure, they impact the enforcement ability, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia experienced this as well, where ultimately they were not that happy with all of the fighters of abroad that joined their ranks because the cohesion got lost in the process. So then, yes, in conclusion, I think the use of force by Rwanda is possibly an example of intervention by invitation, but I think that there's some murkiness around it, some controversy around it. Then foreign fighters and terrorism, if we look at the different forms of NSAs, then we have to look at whether foreign fighters qualify also as terrorists in some instances, and whether that entity is an organized armed group. And then possibly whether we can hold that organized armed group responsible as an entity. Yes, so that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Anil. The one question I have from our side here is, you mentioned that the Rwandan intervention in Mozambique wouldn't qualify as collective self-defense, rather it's intervention by invitation. I think we would definitely agree with you, but are you aware of any reportings by either Rwanda or Mozambique to the Security Council or the AUPSC in this regard? Have they ever claimed that they were acting in self-defense?
No, I don't think that they have. It was more a theoretical exercise from my part, on my part. I'm not that, I didn't look at that in a great amount of detail, so I may be mistaken, but not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. No. Then we'll open up the floor to questions from participants. Okay, Anil, thank you very much. We have no questions from our side, but once again, if you will be around for the end, there could be some questions that come up later.
Thank you very much.
Okay, at this point in time, we're halfway done with the workshop. So I think what we'll do is we're set to have just a several minutes break, and then we'll come back for the fourth session. This side will be back at 4:45, and I think for our participants from South Africa and Mozambique, that's 4:45. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back for the second part of this workshop for today. And we'll go straight into session number 4. Our next speaker is Borges Namire. Can we just get an indication if you can hear us, Borges? And perhaps if we can see you.
Good afternoon from Maputo.
Thank you. Okay, from Maputo. Okay, I will briefly introduce you and then we'll go into your presentation.
Thank you.
Borges is also a researcher and consultant with the Institute for Security Studies. And of course, as we see, he's based in Maputo. He's also a reporter with Bloomberg and an anti-corruption activist with the Center for Public Integrity in Mozambique. Borges is currently undertaking an MSc degree in maritime security at the Joaquim Chissano University. His research in Cabo Delgado is regularly reported on, and he regularly makes appearances in both national and international media houses. Borges, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And can you allow me to share a slide? Yeah, I see I can share here. Just a sec. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you confirm if you can see my slides there?
We confirm we can see it, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So briefly, I will talk about the private military companies present in the Cabo Delgado. In the introduction, we have heard that the conflict in Cabo Delgado emerged in 2017. And the first government reaction was deploying police and military to the ground to try to contain the conflict. That was in 2017, 2018. But early in 2019, 2 years after the conflict emerged, the government relied on private military companies to help it to fight on the ground. So in the beginning, they brought the Russian private military company, Wagner Group, to fight in Cabo Delgado. Maybe I will just explain why the choice for the Russian company. The Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs visited Mozambique, and then he promised that Russia would help Mozambique to fight the insurgency. And the relationship between Mozambique and Russia are of a great friendship since the time of liberation struggle fight. Russia trained Mozambican defense force. At that time, the Frelimo, which is the ruling part, so the Frelimo force, which was fighting the Portuguese. So the relationship between Mozambique and Russia is good and is of great confidence. So that's the reason the government of Mozambique decided to pick a Russian company. The available information show us that this mission was paid by Kremlin. So this was an offer by Russian government to Mozambique to help to fight the insurgents in the Cabo Delgado. So in September 2019, about 200 Russian military arrived in Nacala. Nacala is an international airport near Cabo Delgado. And then they headed to Cabo Delgado by road and started to fight there. But they stayed in Cabo Delgado for only 2 months. Their main mission was to conduct combat operations side by side with the Mozambican army. And by that time, there was a conflict between Mozambican Defense Force and the Russian private military company. There was a disagreement on how to conduct the operations. So the Russian wanted to bomb the areas where they believed the main base of insurgents were located, and Mozambique did not agree on that. And with this speculation of betrayal between Mozambicans and the Russian force. The Russian private company left after 2 months with more than 10 casualties, fatalities, which is huge. And there are, confident reports that some Mozambican defense force facilitated a kind of information to insurgents. So the Russians were ambushed and they left. And after that, immediately, as the Russian left, a second private military company arrived. The name of this company is Dyke Advisor Group. This belongs to a retired colonel, Zimbabwean colonel. So from Rhodesia at that time, the Colonel Lionel died. Now he's based in South Africa and is the CEO of this DAG, which means Dyke Advisor Group. This company, different to the Russian, this company came to support not the army, but the police. And this is something which is interesting to understand in Mozambique. We have police and the military which are not working together at all. Actually, they are competing somehow on who is defending, who is fighting the insurgents on the ground. I might explain why, but at this point, what I wanted to say is that while the Russian came to work with the government, with the defense force, the DAG came to work with police in Cabo Delgado. They stayed there until April 2021, so for approximately 2 years, a year and a half, and they provided basically a logistical support and also air operations, helping the police. Both DAG and Wagner are what is called active private military company, which means they are military providers. And DAG left. Before DAG has left, another private military company, this actually is a joint venture of Paramount and Burnham. Paramount is based in South Africa and Burnham is based in Dubai. So they started in February 2021. This joint venture of 2 private military companies still in Mozambique, they basically provide military advice and training. So this is what's classified as passive PMC, which is a military consultant, not a military provider. And wow, I cannot. Okay, so this picture here, we can see this is one of the DAG helicopter. They use it in the Cabo Delgado. This is in Pemba. We can see here the men in uniform. Those are Mozambican militaries, and we have the white folk here, who is part of the DAG mission. Those are not the Russian, but DAG. So basically, DAG came to Mozambique fully equipped, using some helicopter with gunship. So civilians helicopter converted into military helicopters. And in the next slide, we can see these guys, those are empty, and they used it to make empty nodes. Those have been converted to homemade bombs. So this in Mozambique is sold, if you can see here in Portuguese, it's written gas. So this is the gas used in the cuisine. And then they converted it into bombs. I don't know if this is allowed by law or no. And this is something that has been denounced by Amnesty International. So those kind of, we can see here weapons here. So this has been taken picture within an helicopter of DAG. The detail can show it. So this is how the DAG was equipped, using this kind of bombs. We can see here in detail, this has been posted in a Twitter by someone who has been following the Cabo Delgado conflict. and has some good insight. This is why we can see here RYP. This is the initial of his name. So this shows the detail of this kind of bomb. So they're flying over Musimbo da Praia, where we have civilians mixed with insurgents. They just dropped this kind of bombs, killing indiscriminately everyone and causing destruction. So this is how DAG was operating. There's not a lot of story to tell about DAG because they left after 2 months. But in 1 year and a half of DAG presence in Mozambique, there is a lot to say. And one of their faces is this of non-respecting the civilians, just attacking. And when they have been accused by Amnesty International, they responded saying, okay, all the attack that we conducted, we previously got authorization by a police officer who was flying with us in our helicopter. So we did not attack anyone without previous authorization by a police officer who was on board. And this, which is my last slide, shows us the major insurgent attacks in Cabo Delgado. So I've just picked the one when the insurgents, they did overrun the towns and attacked, occupied a police command, occupied the towns, destroyed the courts, expelled the government and the defense security force. They bombed the banks and robbed the banks. So I'm just showing this one. I'm showing this one in the context of the presence of private military companies in Mozambique. So we can recall that we had Wagner first in 2019 and DAG in, I'm sorry, that is not correct here, DAG in September 2019. And then with the presence of private military companies in Mozambique, the insurgents attacked Musimbo da Praia first in March 2020. They did overrun the town, robbing the banks. So they occupied the town for some few days. And then in same March, they attacked Kisanga district, which is located some 60 kilometers to Pemba, the capital town of Cabo Delgado. Also in April 2020, they attacked and occupied Namakande, which is the capital of Mwidumbi district. They also in May 2020 attacked and occupied Makumia, which is another big district town. In June, same year, they attacked Musimbo da Praia again. So this was the second attack to Musimbo da Praia from March to June, and they occupied Musimbo da Praia again. And maybe this was the biggest attack to Musimbo da Praia. Several defense security forces were killed, and the DAG, who was present in Cabo Delgado, could not provide neither logistic nor air force enough to expel the attackers. Also, they attacked again Musimbo da Praia in August 2020. And in this last attack, they attacked and occupied Musimbo da Praia for almost a year. They have been ejected from Musimbo da Praia in August 2021 when Rwandese arrived. And also in November 2021, they attacked Namakande again for the second time, as they attacked previously in April 2020. So finally, in March 2021, they attacked Palma. And government decided to continue, not to renew the contract with DAG, and decided to bring the foreign military intervention because the private military company's choice has failed. It was a complete tragedy. So it could not stop the insurgent from growing on the ground. It could not stop, it could not protect civilians. It could not provide comprehensive support to government and security forces. As I've said, DAG was working with police while Wagner was working with the military. And DAG could not cooperate and support the defense force but only working with the police. So there is a kind of a competition between the police and the military. And what happened is that with support from DAG, the police felt, okay, we are better prepared now, and we can even ignore the army, and we don't need to cooperate with them. We will work with these private military companies. So this response by government of Mozambique was, this failed completely. It failed completely, did not protect civilians, did not contain the insurgency, it did not support the defense and security force. Actually, there is still a lot to investigate how it was harmful to the civilians in Cabo Delgado, and also how it has fueled the conflict in Cabo Delgado. So briefly, this is my presentation, and I can add more in question and answers, if any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Borges. We'll jump into some of the questions. There are a number of them, especially in terms of the Wagner Group. Could you, I'll give you one or two at a time because they may be somewhat linked. First of all, can you just confirm once again that up to 200 personnel were deployed by the Wagner Group? And does that comprise the entire deployment with administrative staff and so on, or is this just like the mercenaries you're referring to? And then why exactly did the Wagner Group leave? Is it a specific situation, or is it a combination of things? Specifically, you were referring to, there was some tension between the group and the Mozambican armed forces. And there was also what you mentioned, some loss of life. 10, 11 mercenaries were killed, I think in October 2020 or 2021, or is it a combination of these factors that led to them exiting Mozambique?
Yes, thank you. The figures that we have got are of 200 personnel, military personnel. They didn't have administrative people at all because the logistics was done by a Mozambique army. And at that time, something interesting happened, that the army of Mozambique started to release press statement, including video showing the bombing in Cabo Delgado. So Mozambican Defense Force at the central level were so enthusiastic with the presence of the Russian, saying, okay, they have now, the insurgents now have a very limited time to be completely destroyed. So that was so too much effort by the government security force in Mozambique. But what happened is, while at the political level, from Maputo, from the office of the Minister of Defense, Mozambique was happy. On the ground, the military were not happy with the presence of MAG, for several reasons. First of all, what is said that Mozambique asked for military support from Russia. And Russia responded with private military companies, not with the sovereign state force. So that was a surprise on the ground. Secondly, President News always resisted to conduct a massive bombing in Cabo Delgado because he wanted to hide the conflict. By that time of 2019, if we read the articles at that time, Mozambique denied the insurgents. It used to say, okay, this is, they used to call them bandits. They did not assume that this was terrorism. Mozambique only assumed this was terrorism in April 2020. So before that, Mozambique said, oh no, those are just bandits. The local words in Portuguese, they were just saying malfeitores. Malfeitores is just someone who, a pickpocket. And they didn't want to assume. So by having a Russian bombing Cabo Delgado, that would, tell the people that actually this is a big problem. And Mozambique, I think, tried to hide this conflict to protect the 2 billion USD investment in the same region in Cabo Delgado. So I think there was a combination of factors, but those factors are related one each other. First of all, the tension between Mozambique army and the Russians led to to the killings within the Russian. In one of these occasions, what happened is that the insurgents, they managed to infiltrate the barracks, enter in the military barracks where the Russians were located, wearing the government uniform, and then starting to kill them from inside. Well, the question, this happened only with the Russian? No, everywhere where the insurgents entered, they entered using the military uniform, including in Musimbo de Praia, in Palma. So they had a very good capacity to penetrate the Mozambican army, get their secrets, and even there are some codes, in the military operation, there are some daily codes that people use. We were given a code. So imagine you are found within the barrack and they ask you, what is the code? You give the code. And this code changes every day and sometimes time to time. And then the insurgents, sometimes they got this code. So this frustrated the Russian and they decided to leave. That will explain why now the Rwandese who are in Cabo Delgado, they are the one leading the operation. So Mozambique is not on the command of the operation, at least in the 2 districts assigned to Rwandese. But also where we have the Samim force, the South African Defense Force are on the command. So because the corruption within the government of Mozambique, including in the military, is a big problem. So they can just sell information. Well, I'm not saying this happened. I'm just raising hypotheses.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're just going to jump to a question in the chat. Have the invitations or the contracts with these private military groups become public? Have they ever been debated in Mozambique?
No, of course, no for both questions. Actually, the government of Mozambique did not make public the contract, but it has never assumed the presence of those companies. So officially, Mozambique denies that we had a private military company in Mozambique, that we had a private military company in Mozambique. The parliament several times requested information from the ministers, Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, to explain what is the role of the private military company in Mozambique, what is their contract, what is the scope of their presence. And the government just said, we will not discuss our military strategy in parliament because the enemy will know our strategy. So officially, Mozambique never assumed the presence of both Wagner and DAG, including Paramount, which is still in Mozambique. This has never been assumed publicly. So discussed, yes, it has been discussed in Mozambique. It has been discussed in Parliament, but this was like civil society and opposition and the press debating. The government did not say a single word on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to just open the floor to questions, if there are any from the participants that are here today. Okay, there being no questions on this, thank you very much, Borges. There is a discussion session at the end. If you will be staying with us, then maybe some questions will come up. We will move on to the next speaker. I would like to just thank, well, let me first check if they are with us. The EU training mission in Mozambique, could we just see if you can hear us?
Hello.
Okay,
Good afternoon,
you can hear
all.
us, you can see us, everything is good? Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
it is.
Since we discussed this morning of the possibilities and so on, I will leave the introductions up to you and then your presentation.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Lopes from the Portuguese Army, and I'm for the time being deployed in Mozambique in this European Union training mission as a planner. And on behalf of the Brigadier General Lemos Pires, who is the Mission Force Commander. I would like to address you the thank you for this invitation, and therefore I'm here to present our mission and to say what we are doing in Mozambique and in support of Mozambique Armed Forces. So if you don't have any question for the time being, I can go through my presentation, and afterwards we can talk a little bit, or if you have any questions in the end, I can provide you some answers. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Lieutenant. Shall we see your presentation first and then have some discussion afterwards?
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I will try to share the presentation, and I would like to ask you if you are seeing this.
We confirm that we can see the slides, yes.
Okay. So going through my agenda, I will brief you regarding the background, what we are doing, what is the output of our training program, and of course something regarding the interagency concept, because we are not alone in this theater of operations, and some key way aheads and takeaways. I think regarding the background, you already know what was going on regarding the big clashes that Mozambique had during this time. But I would like just to highlight that on 2017, after the first big attack in Simboa da Praia, the Mozambique authorities, they started concerned about the terrorism, and afterwards they asked for help, and international help, of course. And we had one visit, EU visit, that was performed by the Portuguese foreign minister. And during this visit, he was represented the high representative from the European Union. And during this visit, it was more or less established that EU could provide some training for the Mozambican armed forces. The formal request was made on the 2021, more or less in April. And the launch of the mission was very fast. So as you can see, from April 21, the mission was launched in October 21. And we start this mission at that time, in the 1st of November, we start providing training to the Mozambican armed forces. Our mandate was established to train 11 quick reaction forces units to restore the safety and security in Cabo Delgado. The mission commander, which is in Brussels, it's Almirante Lejean, and the mission force commander, it's Brigadier General Lemos Pires. It's from the Portuguese Army. Our mission, we have around 120 people, okay? We have some double-headed personnel in this mission, and the time frame, it will be the 24th month. For the time being, we are yet in the initial operation capability. When we reach the full operation capability, which means that all the troop contribute nations will be in the theater, we are going to start the mandate for 24 months. So our end state, it will be to train the quick reaction forces to be deployed in areas of operations, including Cabo Delgado. Of course, tasked by Mozambican authorities, and which is very important for us in compliance with international and humanitarian law and international human rights law and human and peace security. So it means that our training more than combat training, we are all in line with EU principles and values. And during this training, these subjects, they are mandatory. If we look at this, it's just to highlight that we have two main lines of operations. One, which is regarding the training, and another one that is regarding enabling and coordination. And in the end, regarding enabling and coordination, what we want is to be well accepted in our mission. And regarding the training, of course, we have the Mozambique military units trained and really reliable to protect the civilians. When we talk about the quick reaction forces, as you can imagine, we are talking about combat units, and these units, they have to be prepared to conduct unilateral and joint operations. So it means with all Army, Navy, and Air Force as a reinforced capability with high level of mobility and reactive to decisive response within all environments, with the capability to plan and execute operations. And they have to be self-sustained for a short period of time. So it means that more than have just a combat unit, they are going to be able to plan, to be deployed in some area of operation, and self-sustain with all combat service support assets. So it means that they can provide food for the troops, they can have water, and they can be reliable to be deployed by themselves in some area of operation. So this is, I can call it like our operational output from our train. So we are training these units to be like this, a quick reaction force with all these capabilities. The subject is, we more than provide the training, we try to have the trainers. So it means that more than just provide training, we can train FADAM officers and NCOs to continue the training that we are providing, of course. Always for counterinsurgency and regarding combat technicals and tactics procedures, in compliance with the gender, humanitarian law, and human rights law. We are going to provide some assistance measures, which I will explain a little bit further what is these assistance measures, but just to highlight and stress that this is non-lethal equipment, that it is going to be delivered for these units and give them the capability to plan at the operational level. In Mozambique, our HQ, so our headquarters, they are stayed in Maputo. As well, we have at the Catemba training area, we have the training area for the Navy Quick Reaction Force, and by the north in Chimoio, where I am today, we deliver for training for the Army of Mozambique, the commandos. Regarding another line of operations within our mission, I've talked about the training, and now getting a little bit focused on our interagency concept, because we are not just here to deliver training. So it means that we go along with the armed forces, international community and partners and stakeholders within the population, and of course, by ourselves. So it means that all these four vectors are important for us to get some mindset, if we can call like this, mindset for EU values, which are very important for us, not just delivering the training by themselves. Some kind of examples that we have, we are dealing with some rebuilds within the training areas, which will be served by our trainers and of course for the trainees too. We have some subjects that are delivering lectures by the International Red Cross and United Nations. We had some conference within the FADAM and the population and international community. And of course, regarding the population, we have some humanitarian aid, which is a small project, but with a very good impact within the population. Here you can find some examples. We have delivered some food, some clothes, and try to support some local institutes that are here, and of course they need some help. Within this, more than deliver the clothes or the food, it's the mindset that the military personnel, not just EU personnel, because as you can see, we always invite FADAM, so Mozambican Armed Forces, to be with us within these activities. Regarding the European peace facilities, the assistance measures that I've been talking about. So along the train, we are going to deliver some equipment, non-lethal equipment. And this is the first time that the European Union is using this mechanism to support and provide for some countries. So in this case, Mozambique. So Mozambique, it will be the prototype for this assistance measures mechanism. And we are going to provide some individual equipment for the soldiers, collective equipment at the level, at company level. So we are talking about 140 military personnel, ground mobility assets too, and some technical device like some small drones to go along the operations, and so that they can see a little bit further than they can see now in this moment. But just to highlight that this is non-lethal equipment, and this is mandatory for European Union. The assistance measures, as I mentioned, this comes from European Peace Facility, COGINTA, which is international enterprise that is going to do the procurement and deliver to FADAM this equipment. And European Training Mission is just supporting this process so that the FADAM can be equipped to perform the tasks that we are training. And with this, I just conclude almost my briefing and saying that our mission, what we want, is to have a self-sustained quick reaction force to be able to conduct full spectrum missions. Of course, not just military missions, but having in mind to protect the civilians, having in mind to have the ability to conduct some support to the civilians, train and equip through this assistance measures mechanism, and not just deliver the training for the Mozambique Armed Forces, but also within this interagency concept, which is our EU integrated approach that most of you already have listened about this. And with this, I just conclude my briefing, and I'm available, depending your questions, to answer the things or the questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel. I think we're going to open up the floor straight away in case there are questions here.
Actually, I do have a question, if I could. I would be interested into, let's say, knowing about the, let's say, effectiveness of the EU integrated approach, and actually how much it may hamper the primary goals of the mission, because this move towards missions which combine civilian and military aspects has been with us for already quite some time. But since this is a mission which is called a training mission, so I was just sort of interested into how it looks in practice, because what looks nicely on the paper or as an idea, where it certainly makes sense that EU integrated approach, I would be interested into whether you can already draw from some experience of your mission in Mozambique, whether that integrated approach actually works, and whether it's not impairing on the main goals of the mission, which would be the training for maybe obvious reasons, that you just, in order to distribute humanitarian aid and things like that, you need personnel, you need to ensure the security, and so on and so on. I don't know whether the question is clear enough.
Yep. Yes, it is clear, and I would like just to say that, of course, EU integrated approach is much more larger than our interagency concept that we have in place on the ground. Okay, so it's much bigger. So we call it integrated approach because it's the mindset. So, and the mindset is, of course, we are delivering the training, and we are trying to have this mindset also for the Mozambican Armed Forces. It means that, as I mentioned before, we are not just looking forward for them to deliver the training, but we are looking forward for them to have a look on the population, how they can help, how can they use the equipment that we are going to deliver to protect and to help the populations when they are deployed in some training, in some area of operation. This is the mindset regarding the Mozambican forces that we are training. Okay, and this is one aspect. Another aspect that we have is, as a European Union training mission in place in Mozambique, more than deliver the training, we try to call the FADAM authorities, not only the units that we are delivering the training, but we call the FADAM to go with us to distribute this humanitarian aid, so that we can have, how can I say, the view of the population from the FADAM change a little bit, to look at them as a reliable, because they are reliable, and it's just to change a little bit the view of the population, to have a look on their own armed forces as an asset that is here to provide them some aid. So this is more or less our goal within this interagency concept. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yes, thank you. My point was, and I have that from different sources, it just does not concern the like military or EU training missions, but in generally, let's say, activities of the European Union in general, that sometimes the countries, not only in Africa, but well, within the reach of the activities of the EU, sometimes they get what they do not ask for just because the EU thinks it's a good idea, and something which looks nicely for the Europeans does not necessarily reflect the needs of the people on the ground in that specific area. So that's why my question was rather going in that direction, whether, according to your experience, this approach and what you do and how the mission is designed reflects, let's say, the facts on the ground and what the country needs and asked for. Let's put it this way.
Yeah. Okay. I don't have the tools to measure the way that you are asking me. Okay. I don't have the tools to measure how many percentage of the population accepts or not the EU training mission here. But I do know and I do feel that the FADAM, when I call FADAM, it's Mozambican Armed Forces, I do know that they are along with us in these projects. Okay, and remember that we are a training mission, military training mission, so we don't go for the political level. Even though we have some connections, we don't go for the political level. So we are along with the armed forces. And I can tell you that they see these opportunities as we see it. So we are not saying that it is mandatory. We are trying to influence them to come with us. And they are seeing the main effect that this kind of aids and try to show a little bit more the FADAM flag within these projects. They see it useful, okay, and they see it as a tool to change the mindset. This is my own perspective. Okay, this is not a measure or something that I can have proofs. This is my view and my perspective. Okay,
that was what I was asking for. So thank you.
And within the activities that we have conducted with them. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We have just one question as well from the chat. How, if at all, has the presence of private military groups affected your mission? Have you had any contact with them? Has there been any effect at all?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't...
Has there been any effect on your mission based on the presence of some of the private military companies that have supposedly been in Mozambique?
We are so focused on our training mission, and the training mission is to deliver train for the FADAM. And within our training is a 16 weeks program. And during these 16 weeks, I don't see anything that we cannot accomplish during this time. So,
okay, thank you.
Our goals.
Yeah, thank you very much. If there are any other questions from the floor.
Well, I may have one follow-up question to the previous one. When you go to train, Mozambique Armed Forces, how active is your training? Is it a training just in training facilities, or is your training more active? More active means when Mozambique Army goes to fight insurgents, are your trainers with them there in the field or not?
Yeah, the mandate and our training mission stops in Cabo Delgado. So we are not able to conduct operations with them. We are a EU non-executive mission. Okay, so it means when I say EU non-executive mission, it means that we are not here to conduct operations along with the Mozambican Armed Forces. So it means that we are just responsible to deliver the training, how to explain with them. And of course, if you remember when I said that we have the Train the Trainers program, so it means that every time we have one trainer from EU, we have the same trainer from FADAM. So if we are delivering some operational planning, we have one EU officer and we have one Mozambican officer along delivering this training. So it means that the training program is very important so that they can continue the process after we go, because we just have 2 years mandate. Okay, but of course we are a few members here, 120 more or less. Okay, so and we don't have the military assets to go in operations. We are not allowed.
Thank you.
We are EU non-executive mission.
Any further questions from the floor?
I would like to have one. A question, during your TOT training, have you identified a possible risk of green on blue attack? Means if there's a possibility of infiltration of insurgents in the Mozambican army. Is it clear?
I'm sorry, but if someone that is close to the speaker.
Pardon? I would like to ask about the possible risk of green on blue attacks during your TOT training.
Yeah. Okay. As you can manage, I can tell you that we have the procedures for a kind of that situation, but it's normal whenever we are going to deliver training, even if it is in Mozambique or another place. We call it, it's our security. It's mandatory to have it, but it's not in Mozambique. It's not an issue. It's very different than other places, for instance, that I've been in the past. So it's very different. They accept, they are along with us. They see us as, how can I say this, something that they will be they will have operational gaining with us, and they see us as a friend. They don't see us a kind of possibility of green on blue. But if you ask if we have plans for these kind of situations, of course it's mandatory in military training like this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think given time constraints, we'll have to end the questions there. Lieutenant Colonel, we do have a discussion session afterwards. So if you do have the ability to stay with us, then one more session afterwards, and then there is a discussion session where if there are further questions, they could come up. But if not, we completely understand. And thank you for your availability today. We understood, and as I explained, as we spoke this morning, I explained there were some complications earlier today, but ultimately things worked out. So thank you very much. And we will now move on to our final speaker. Let's see, Prof. Martha Bradley. Marty, can you see us? Can you hear us? There we go.
I can, thank you so much. I would just have to share my PowerPoints.
Okay, Marty, some of us may be familiar with Marty. So Marty is today the final speaker of the session. Marty is a lecturer at the Department of Public Law at the University of Pretoria. She's also a research associate at the South African Research Chairs Initiative at the University of Johannesburg. And she's also an external expert here at SIGOL. She has previously published in leading international journals on topics within international humanitarian law, including with the International Review of the Red Cross. Apart from regular and invited lecturing at the University of Pretoria and Palatzky University, Marty has also lectured at the military department of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in Sanremo. Marty's area of focus and specialization includes the law of non-international armed conflicts, conflict classification, customary law of non-international armed conflict, and the law of command responsibility. Marty, the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. Marco, if you can just indicate if you can see my slideshow.
I confirm, yes, we can see the slideshow and we hear you perfectly.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It is indeed a pleasure to be here virtually, especially as an external expert. It's wonderful also to see my former Deputy Dean, Dr. Fikes, and I believe that my doctoral supervisor, Professor De Wet, is also in the audience, so it is quite a homecoming. I was asked today to elaborate on the classification of the conflict in Cabo Delgado, and I will focus specifically on Al-Shabaab, also referred to as IS Mozambique. I do think that there's a lot of narrative being used, such as terrorism or insurgency, and not necessarily the correct legal term for what the situation is. So my presentation is structured as follows. First, I will speak to briefly, since we have many military members in the room, so you will know this, but to have a nice flow, I will speak about the importance of conflict classification, below the threshold and Cabo Delgado, Common Article 3 NIACs, which I call over the threshold and Cabo Delgado, additional Protocol 2 NIACs and Cabo Delgado, the possibility of internationalized armed conflicts, of course, this is a term of art, and then some concluding remarks and questions. So, conflict classification, why bother? Essentially, conflict classification is important because it determines the legal framework applicable to a situation, be it the law of peacetime, which is basically the law of law enforcement and human rights law, or international humanitarian law, once an armed conflict comes into existence. After this has been determined, the category of conflict, then the type of armed conflict determines the corpus of IHL that applies. For example, the law of international armed conflict or the law of non-international armed conflict. Finally, conflict classification is important from an international criminal law perspective, as there is a nexus between the existence of an armed conflict of a certain nature and the commission and prosecution of war crimes. So, what you are seeing on this slide are situations which are below the thresholds of NIACs. So this slide presents basically the escalation pattern that we associate with non-international armed conflicts. So below the threshold, and that is where this arrow is pointing, are situations such as internal disturbances, sporadic acts of violence, political protests, insurgencies, and perhaps gang-related violence. And you will see a red line in front of you. So the purpose of the minimum threshold of violence tests enshrined in the notion of intensity is to separate situations which resembles an armed conflict in character, but in which the fighting is not sufficiently violent to elevate such situations above the law enforcement paradigm, which is regulated by domestic law and human rights law, and into the sphere of non-international armed conflict. The minimum threshold of violence in terms of non-international armed conflict and treaty law is crossed when violence escalates beyond the degree of violence that is associated with merely sporadic acts, such as riots, rebellions, and internal disturbances. And that is also indeed the type of phrases that the Mozambican government is continuing continuously using to describe the situation in Cabo Delgado. So once there is an escalation beyond the red line, then we move into the realm of non-international armed conflicts. And this is what we call the Tadik formula. And I will turn to Tadik a little bit later. So once Tadik is met, then we move on to Common Article 3 type NIACs, and that is protracted armed violence, plus a certain degree of organization by the armed group. Then IHL is triggered, the law of non-international armed conflict. It is then possible that this traditional non-international armed conflict escalates even more into the effect that the additional requirements under Article 1.1 of AP2 is in fact satisfied, and then Article 1.1 triggers the application of additional Protocol 2. Of course, a state has to be a party for AP2 to apply, and Mozambique is indeed a party to additional Protocol 2. Then there is a second line, which is indeed purple. And here we speak, or Dinstein refers to this as an over the threshold situation. This is when the nature of the conflict becomes internationalized owing to the involvement of other state parties. But just to flag that internationalized NIACs is indeed a term of art. We only have non-international armed conflicts and international armed conflicts, and they can indeed exist in parallel. But we will now move to employ the factual situation in Cabo Delgado to these differing categories. So the first category that we are looking at is non-international armed conflicts that meet the minimum threshold under Common Article 3. Trial Chamber 1 of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia refined the Tadik formula in such a manner that the definitional criteria could serve to determine the existence of a non-international armed conflict, because, of course, the Geneva Conventions did not offer a definition. I should highlight that this definition has been so widely employed that even at the time, the formulation itself was already, when the ICTI phrased it, was already, in fact, a confirmation of existing custom. So indeed, this is the customary understanding of the definition of non-international armed conflict. So I will now look at these two elements separately in terms of the situation in Cabo Delgado. Indeed, both the notion of organization and the notion of intensity has to be satisfied in order to determine if we are indeed dealing with a non-international armed conflict. Just for those in the audience to follow the flow of this presentation, we have now moved beyond the realm of internal disturbances, and we are looking specifically if the situation satisfies that of a non-international armed conflict. So on this slide, you will see a non-exhaustive list of indicators that are employed on a case-by-case basis to determine if the minimum threshold of organization has been met. These indicators were first introduced by the ICTY and has been widely employed. There is general consensus among scholars that essentially the organizational criterion is met when an armed group is sufficiently organized to launch military operations, as this essentially speaks to the existence of a command structure, logistics, military tactics, and so forth. In addition, some scholars state that the ability to apply and enforce Common Article 3 is constitutive. I want to mention that Al-Shabaab also speaks with one voice. You will see the requirement of speaking with one voice, often through the official channels of IS. So it is very clear, and this is where there's an interlinkage between organization and indeed the level of intensity, the fact that organization is effectively measured, even organized armed group can launch a military operation. So it is clear from the frequency and ongoing attacks and engagements between Al-Shabaab and the Mozambican armed forces and the forces supporting Mozambique that this level of organization is met. It's important to note that we do not demand under Common Article 3, does not demand the same type of sophisticated organizational structure akin to a military. In fact, not only vertical command structures, but also fluid horizontal structures are accepted as long as there's enough evidence of this ability to launch military operations. I want to flag an important point, that even though Al-Shabaab has pledged allegiance to IS, this does not automatically confer that Al-Shabaab meets an organizational criterion. No, whether or not a group is in fact, constitutes in fact under IHL an organized armed group bound by Common Article 3 and becoming a party to the conflict depends on whether that group on a case-by-case basis meets this criterion. The same goes for coalitions and alliances. So in my assessment, it is quite clear that even though you see perhaps smaller fighting units of 8 armed men engaging, that even though these are smaller fighting units, even though it appears that the hierarchy might be horizontal in a sense, they still meet the requirement of an organized armed group. I note that there's the narrative of these are a terrorist group because of the IS affiliation, but in IHL, we look at the facts, and indeed, this is an organized armed group. Now to intensity. In the Harudina case, the ICTY listed indicators, non-constitutive in nature, to be employed on a case-by-case basis in order to assess if a situation equates to protracted armed violence, which is the minimum level of intensity demanded by a situation under Common Article 3. It is clear from the available conflict trackers, and we had 2 wonderful presentations today, and the first presentation and also on the involvement of the private military companies that showed the frequency of attacks. And it is very clear from the conflict trackers that the notion of intensity is met. There's between 750,000 and 800,000 Mozambicans who have been internally displaced. This is a huge number. The frequency of attacks also remains very consistent. If you look at one of the conflict trackers, you will see that there is at least, it remains quite steady, that there's at least 90 civilians killed per month, and that the conflict is not decreasing, or at least the frequency of attacks between our engagements, between the armed forces or SADC mission and indeed Al-Shabaab. So Borges, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. I missed the start of your presentation. In your presentation, highlighted the major attacks launched by Al-Shabaab and the response by the Mozambican armed forces and international involvement is indeed further evidence that this is met. It is seen as a high indicator of protracted armed violence when a state actually do not employ the police anymore, but the state military to engage. I think the question rather would be exactly when this minimum threshold was met and when the situation transcended from internal disturbances or insurgency into the realm of non-international armed conflict, especially as there is some talk about the possible commission of war crimes and the explicit targeting of civilians. This is more difficult to determine because most of the conflict trackers only started recording from August 2020. So I do not want to speculate on when exactly that moment was that this situation became a NIAC, but I would say at least, at minimum, from March 2020, where there was territorial control of a major port. So now I turn briefly to the assessment of intensity. And this is the question of how do we assess if a situation equates protracted armed violence. And I won't focus too much on the bilateral assessment. There is something unique, or unfortunately not that unique, I guess, about the situation in Cabo Delgado, that originally Al-Shabaab focused attacks against civilians to terrorize and against civilian populations and where they live. Whilst intensity assessment is conducted through looking at the ferocity of fighting between the organized armed group, Al-Shabaab, and the Mozambican armed forces. So frequently we see that Al-Shabaab attacks a village, and then the Mozambican armed forces comes to the defense of the village, or this was specifically so at the beginning of the situation. Now this trend is continuing, that Al-Shabaab is targeting villages and also engaging with the armed forces. So in the Ong Weng decision, which was a very recent decision of 2020 by the ICC, there was a similar situation. And the ICC actually used an aggregation of violence because they couldn't detangle the indicators of violence between deaths and internally displaced people resulting from attacks against villages or resulting from fighting between armed forces and the organized armed groups. So indeed, there's no doubt to my mind that the level of intensity is met, but the when is indeed a question, and perhaps the aggregation would help us to determine that more clearly at the beginning of the conflict. So now I will briefly speak to Additional Protocol 2. So essentially, there are 4 requirements that has to be met to trigger the application of Additional Protocol 2. Why does Additional Protocol 2 matter? Because it does offer many more guarantees, especially towards the protection of children and women in armed conflicts. Of course, there's the argument that a lot of the provisions inherent in Additional Protocol 2 has reached customary status, but indeed Mozambique is a party to Additional Protocol 2. There is an understanding, and I want to highlight the territorial control requirements, that this requirement is important in the sense that it is a logical starting point of whether or not the requirements are met. Why? Because territorial control, in fact, speaks to the fact that there is a responsible command structure and there is an ability to carry out sustained and concerted military operations, because otherwise the organized armed group would not have been able to hold on to territory that escapes the control of the government, and because of the nature of the demands under AP2 to the parties, territory also enables them to implement Additional Protocol 2, and you will see the term ability to implement, which is really important here. I want to flag in terms of territorial control, because we can see from the facts that Al-Shabaab has consistently held control since at least March 2020 over some parts of Mozambican territory. Essentially, as per the Say case from the Special Tribunal of Sierra Leone, it does not matter if the spatial dimensions fluctuate during the AP2 type conflict, as long as there is, for the most part, control over parts of the territory by organized armed groups. And we note that even though they have lost territory, according to the available intelligence, since at least March 2020, Al-Shabaab has maintained control over territory, important military control, meaning that the fact that the military are controlling the territory to the effect that it escapes control of government forces. Now, finally, some remarks on the escalation of these Additional Protocol 2 type conflicts, and if it is in fact an over the threshold situation. So indeed, conflicts can become internationalized, this term of art, and that will have an impact on conflict classification. So in TANDIC, you can see two options. It is possible that an international armed conflict can exist in parallel to a non-international armed conflict because another state intervenes through its troops, or if a state in fact uses an organized armed group to act on behalf of that state in the territorial state. So this is essentially my understanding, and of course we have members of the EU mission and those on the ground will have a better understanding, but my understanding of the situation in Cabo Delgado looks as follows. We have on the one side the non-state party, which is Al-Shabaab, and they are fighting against the state armed forces of Mozambique that is supported by other state as well as international organizations. So we still have a NIAC. We don't have an outside state supporting Al-Shabaab or fighting alongside Al-Shabaab, because the meaning of military support is contentious, right? But we don't have that situation. Here we have an organized armed group fighting against state armed forces and the state armed forces allies in the forms of states and SADC. So there isn't a change in the conflict status. This is still a non-international conflict, and the law of non-international conflict applies. Indeed, there's no international body that is responsible for declaring the existence of a NIAC under IHL. It is so that in hindsight, the ICC does so to determine, in fact, if there is a basis to prosecute war crimes. And one has to be very careful, of course, when you consider a situation to be a NIAC or to classify a situation, because, of course, the law of non-international conflict offers less protection than human rights law. But indeed, that protection is of seminal importance when, in fact, the situation is a NIAC and the government has lost control. So in my mind, this is a clear situation of a common Article 3 type non-international conflict, and perhaps, but we do not have all the information. I believe there's also, it's possible to have an additional Protocol 2 type NIAC. Sorry. I will, sorry. I don't know if I'm still audible. We had a bit of a power intervention.
Hi, Marty. Yes, we can still hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Apologies. There was a bit of, in South Africa, sometimes the electricity is not that stable, but I'm still here. So essentially, I was concluding that, to my view, there is indeed a non-international conflict, CA3 at minimum AP2, not yet an international conflict in parallel because the conflict has not been internationalized. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Marty. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions from participants.
Wonderful, and I am fully back.
Marty, perhaps from a different perspective, somewhat related to IHL, we have some prior questions sent in. I'll just address it to you if you could answer it. What is the current international law mechanisms to hold PMCs accountable for violations?
That is one of the more difficult questions in terms of private military companies, because they are not actors under public international law. If we look at the Chappelle of Common Article 3. It says that Common Article 3 binds the parties to the conflict, which can only be the organized armed group, right? And the state armed forces. AP2, even more sophisticated, only those organized armed groups that meets Article 1.1 and the state armed forces. So international law will not be the correct mechanism, or IHL does not prescribe, but there will have to possibly be a treaty that actually imposes that kind of binding nature, because it is not a traditional actor in public international law. But that is definitely an area that needs more consideration. I'm sure Martin is nodding his head, so I think he agrees with that, that point.
Thank you very much. I just want to see if there's any other questions. Okay, Martin, it seems there will be no other questions, but we're going to head into a discussion now. So if you'll stay with us, then there could possibly be some questions.
Thank you.
So for the speakers that are still with us, I'll address the questions to all of you. So whoever would like to answer can please go for it. The first question we want to pose is, in the complex plethora of issues and factors contributing to the conflict, is it possible to identify a link between the conflict and water security or competition over water resources? From a different perspective, is water either a target or a weapon used during this conflict?
We don't have watches with us anymore. So.
Okay. Okay, a second question. How do international and regional actors add to triggers of the military conflict going on there? Perhaps we could ask the EU mission representative to guide us through the question. How has, because now as we understand there are three different actors. We have the EU there now in a training capacity, but then we also have the SADC mission there and the Rwandan mission. So how do they operate together, and is there any risk that we have so many different actors in the region? And then of course I think at some point there was also a US training mission there as well.
Yes, well, when we arrived in November, and of course we have our assessment from who were providing some training and who were present in the theater. And one of the main interagency concepts that we have too, along with the other activities that we were planned to perform. One of the first goals that we had was get together with all the presents, and so we call it the 5 Ps meeting, the 5 partners meeting. And why we call it partners? Because we have French, we have the British, United States, Portuguese, and EU. So we try to put in the same table all these actors so that we could talk a little bit of which one we were doing and what were the main goals, so that we are not in competition, and so we can align some kind of training so that we can overlap and we have some kind of how can I say, enhance our activities. This was the main goal. So we had this first meeting in November, and then we had the second one in January, and we call it I think it was someone from Samin, but they weren't available to come with us, and even to Mozambican forces, so that we can have international efforts aiming for the same objectives and not in competition, because we are not here in competition. We are here to support Mozambican armed forces and the Mozambican authorities to deal with this situation in Cabo Delgado. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. We're going to just open up the floor one more time for any last questions in the room, or if there are any other questions from our participants. Now would be the time to ask. If not, then I think we would be in a position to close the session. Okay, there being no questions. For those of us that are left online, thank you very much for your participation. Once again, to the speakers that are also left, we really thank you and appreciate your time. And then do we actually want to quickly call Marty up? Marty, could you quickly just unmute yourself?
Yes.
We just a small little announcement. We just want to thank you because Marty kindly agreed to give this presentation today, and it's actually her birthday today. So Marty, from all of us here and all the participants, happy birthday, and we hope we didn't take too much time up on such a good day.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. That's so lovely. Thank you so much. Lovely to share my birthday once again with you. I think I shared it with Martin in 2019.
So from the rest of us here, thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you to everyone that came to Olomouc today. And I think we will now close the session.
Thank you.
That is